Welcome to Soul of Travel podcast. I'm so excited today to be joined by Lily Girma, who is a full-time travel news reporter and freelance journalist who specializes in sustainable tourism, reporting, and storytelling. She also recently launched Tourism Lens, which is offering news and insight and tips on meaningful travel. She really tells stories that are ones that I want to read and is talking about things that are really important to me. So I was so excited to be able to connect with you and bring you on to this platform to be able to share, your expertise and your journey as well. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's really great to be here and wonderful to be among such amazing colleagues on your podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, to begin our conversation, I'd love to just turn it over to you and give you the opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are in tourism right now, and then we'll back it up and understand how you got here.
Sure. So currently I am a full-time travel news reporter with Bloomberg Pursuits, which is the lifestyle luxury arm of Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Business Week. So I contribute there full-time during the week and write travel stories that are a blend of consumer facing with the business perspective to the stories.
Great.
And yeah,
Go ahead. I mean, you can continue.
that's fine.
And I would love to then kind of understand, how your background and your experiences as a child growing up, I know they really influenced the way that you approach travel and storytelling and began to shape how you engage with the world. And I would love to hear from you a little bit about that part of your journey, and then we'll move into your early career and then your transition into travel.
Sure. It's my favorite part to talk about. I was born in Ethiopia, in East Africa, and I left there when I was very young, barely a year old. And my family moved us to the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, on the a West African country that used to be a French colony. And I pretty much grew up there, spent most of my childhood all the way up to 14, 17 even. And French became my mother tongue, which is, very unusual. And at the same time at home, I learned Amharic, which is a national Ethiopian language. So I had a very Ethiopian household. We grew up with knowing about everything about our culture, our food, our holidays, etc. And so at home, I spoke Amharic, or at least I listened to it and learned it. And at school, I would be speaking French with my friends, and my friends were from all over the world. I had friends from France, from Lebanon, from Madagascar, like you name it. And I know that experience as a kid, growing up in a multicultural environment around multiple, diverse, not just ethnicities, but religions, and beliefs and everything, shaped my outlook on life and my interest, and the things that I look out for. Travel was really just an important mechanism for connecting me to my family overseas. I went to high school at some point when I was 14. My dad gave me the opportunity to go study in Europe, in England. He said I could go there, or I could stay in the Ivory Coast and finish the French school. And of course, right then I was like, oh my God, Europe. Yes, I want to go. And I was 14 at the time, and I still went there, and I was, all the way across the Atlantic attending boarding school at an all-girls school in Bournemouth, south of England, full time away from my parents during the year. And every holiday I'd get to fly home if it was Christmas or summer. And so I was boarding all these flights, on my own. And I loved everything about travel, from the moment you drive to the airport to getting on the long haul flight, etc. And then from there we went to the United States, and I was at the time at college age. So I applied for a couple of universities, and we were in the Maryland, Washington, D.C. area. My father got a job in DC, so that's why we kind of moved there. And I went to college and it was a major culture shock. And then from there, at some point, I fell in love with the Caribbean. So my whole trajectory has been about just being around multiple cultures and multiple languages. I speak four of them fluently, and I can't, give myself credit for being a genius. I really just learned them when I was a kid. So, the Spanish part, yes, I did learn in school, but that came easily because I spoke French. So all of these have been huge advantages for me that I didn't realize at the time. I kind of just took them for granted. When
Yeah.
I, yeah, so when I arrived in the United States, and experienced a very different atmosphere, which I had begun feeling in the UK as well, of just a very kind of divided approach, to everyday life. I started noticing just things like, I'd go to the movies and depending on which movie theater I picked in which neighborhood, that would determine the makeup of who was attending that movie theater, whether it was Black folks or not, and that used to just be really jarring to me because I had never experienced anything like that anywhere else. So all of these thoughts and experiences starting just influencing my outlook on travel, on the importance of a cultural exchange, and the love for just meeting new people in different places, trying new foods, speaking different languages. I just loved all of it.
Mm-hmm. I love the kind of the idea of thinking about that experience you had in your childhood and having a classroom with that, like you said, that richly diverse setting and kind of how easily that allows you to understand how big the world is, even while being in just one place. I know that was one thing for me that I really sensed that growing up, but I was in a rural community in Montana, so I had no
Uh,
diversity of any kind. I just knew that there was something out there. And I remember being really young and telling my mom, I'm like, why don't we have culture here? And I think really, is
yeah.
why is everything the same here? Or why isn't there diversity was really the question I was after, but I was too young. I just sensed that there was something else. And so I love that you really were able to experience that. And also that it was something that seemed just so much a part of your life that it wasn't something for me, like I couldn't really conceive it, but for you, it just painted that picture. And then
Yes.
so like traveling at such a young age and feeling so free and confident and kind of bold, like it was I would imagine a very empowering experience. So travel all of a sudden becomes, about all of these things.
Yeah, I want to add that I think that courage came from watching my own parents traveling abroad. The reason we moved here because my dad had got this job as an economist, at the African Development Bank. So he was kind of a diplomat, and he would travel all the time for work, and sometimes take my mom, and they would go on vacation. Sometimes I went with them, but a lot of times they took couples trips, to Brazil and to Paris, and they'd take my oldest brother, and all of these photos were photos I used to look at over and over in the photo albums. Back in the day we had photo albums, and I used to imagine myself in these places, and we used to have National Geographic, subscription and all of these things. So I think that definitely made me braver just watching my parents do it, and I think that definitely was a huge influence.
Yeah, I would agree because even my own daughters, for them, they're like, I wonder where I'll go to college. And they're like, France, Mexico, New York, they don't have any of that kind of those boundaries or barriers because we have conversations about these places all the time and it feels very available to them.
Mm.
So I do think that really, really shapes kind of the way you might even think about the world when you start to have it painted for you in that way. So we kind of have an understanding of where you came from, but how then did you set out to become an attorney? And then what really was the shift that told you you needed to return to travel or make travel a bigger part of your life?
Yeah, so I decided to go to law school. I took a couple of years off after college. Well, not totally off because I was working full time. I was working as a translator at the World Bank, a language assistant and translator, thinking that that's what I wanted to do. And I quickly realized it was too boring for me, too monotonous. And I started talking to different people, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to business school. So it seemed like law school was the thing to do. And I applied to law school. I went to UVA, which is a great school, a great atmosphere. But, you know, when you come out of these huge schools with loans and, that the single path is always, okay, I'm going to start at a law firm. I don't know much. Let me get some experience. And I'm going to date myself, but when I joined my first law firm, which was is still around, a huge firm based in New York, it was just after September 11. And so it was a really catastrophic time to start a new job. But at the same time, we were not laid off and we were told to do whatever work came across our desks. And I thought, okay, I don't know much anyway, so I'll just get as much experience as I can. And over the years, I just felt pretty dissatisfied and thought, surely this isn't why I went to law school. I was doing a lot of pro bono immigration work, which made me happy and exposed me a little bit to the multicultural, side of life again. But I realized it's not what I love to do. And in my free time, in my vacation time, I would just go to Europe, or I would just basically fly off for a long weekend, go to Rome, go to Barcelona and Lisbon, and I love to shop, and I just was always looking for a way out. And so while I was working full time as a lawyer, I started just side gigs, side ventures, and I started this online shop selling items that I would bring from different countries online, and it was doing really well, but again, it was just not, it wasn't the fit. So I tried different things, it wasn't just overnight. And then I was burnt out and I decided to take 6 weeks sabbatical and go to the Caribbean, because it was a place where I had gone by myself on vacation for the first time as an adult, like a solo traveler type of vacation. And I went to St. Lucia and I stayed at this place called the Body Holiday. I had accumulated weeks of holiday. And so as a result of that trip, which turned out to be amazing, and I realized there was a whole other side of the Caribbean that no one talked about outside of resorts. So I said, let me go back to the Caribbean and maybe teach myself photography, which I loved, and just take time off to figure out what I'm going to do next. And the 6 weeks turned into 5 months, and I went to Jamaica, and I spent 5 months in Jamaica and started getting photography gigs, paid. I started my blog, which used to be called Sun and Stilettos, and built a little bit of a following, and people were very intrigued at the time of seeing a different Caribbean. And that's where it really started. I got in touch with a couple of editors who became kind of my unofficial mentors. They used to work at Matador Network. And this is way back in the day. And I started writing just, one-off digital articles and selling my photos. And then from there, it just kind of grew. And I will say that it wasn't, people always see you doing well at something and they think it just happened overnight. Mm-hmm. But it didn't, So for about 2 years, I was doing winter in the US and spring and summer in the US and working at a law firm part-time, saving up my money, and then going to the Caribbean to do my journalism for the winter. Yeah. And I did that for several years until I could actually make it a full-time thing. And that's when the guidebooks came in.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that people see where you are now and just assume that's kind of where you started because they don't know the whole journey. And I think that's why this podcast is so important, because I think it's just a way that humans categorize people. So they just, this is the way I know you, this is the shape you must have always been in. But to see all the things that happen to get people where they're going, I think is really important. And especially when people are inspired to start out and launch their own business or become a travel writer, for them to realize that they can't really set their sights on this like last version or middle version of where you are as their goal. They have to kind of look at all the pieces to get there. So I think it's important to acknowledge.
Especially as a storyteller, it takes time to develop your voice and to develop confidence in what you have to say and to actually figure out what it is you have to say that's different from everybody else. It takes time. It's a skill, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And I love that, when you mentioned that you went to the Caribbean, that, you were noticing those stories that you hadn't seen before. So, that's kind of maybe the beginning of your voice, you recognizing that that's the thing that feels important to you, and seeing where you are as a writer now. Like I can see like, aha, that's where Lily was like, wait, what is this all about?
Yeah,
This feels like the thing that is missing or important, or the thing I could really, lend my
yeah.
voice to.
It's incredible when I think about it, in hindsight. I think there was so many moments when I doubted myself, and I thought, wow, everybody probably thinks I'm crazy, or no one's really interested. And why this magazine's not interested in this, local travel, and before local travel became a thing,
Mhm.
before FAR came along, even FAR magazine is one of the first I remember doing assignments for that where they wanted to see the local Jamaica, and they wanted, the more insider kind of take on places.
Mhm.
Um, but it wasn't that common before that. And then Moon guides, which I started doing guidebooks for, they're very, all about hyper local tips and information.
Mhm.
But yeah, so seeing it grow, was nice. At some point it was kind of validating,
Mhm.
but it's also a lesson in really believing in yourself, and sticking to your guns, even if no one else is doing it.
Yeah, I think that's something that has come up over and over and over in these conversations as well. Is there's so many times when you've had to stand in that moment where people are telling you like you are
Oh
making
yeah.
a crazy choice,
Oh
or
my
you're
God.
not doing the right thing, and you have to
Yeah.
say no, you're wrong.
Oh yeah. I mean, my family thought I was crazy for a long time. And I quit my law career, and just, in the beginning was like, oh yeah, take a break. You need it. Yeah, sure. And then when the break just never ended, or whatever they thought was a break, it was catastrophic. It's kind of like, no, 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 no. What are you gonna do next? What are you getting back to? I'm a travel journalist. What?
Yeah.
It's just not, yeah, not a thing.
Yeah, and especially I think, as a parent now, especially to see your child achieve something like becoming an attorney, which might feel like such an
Oh,
incredible thing to see, then to see them kind of throw that away, if you will, would be a
that's,
really hard, that would just be, you really have to stand up for yourself to be able to combat kind of what you must have been feeling in that
yeah.
period of transition.
Yeah, I guess as a parent, that makes sense. At the time, I was not thinking of the parent angle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned beginning to write guidebooks, and I know that you found yourself in Belize, and then that experience ended up becoming, the opportunity to write a guidebook for the country. What happened with that scenario? How did that evolve?
So yeah, that's really a pivotal time in my career as a travel writer, because I was very close to giving up, to tell you the truth, Christine. I was thinking, is there really a career in this travel writing thing? And am I really going to be able to make enough money to survive? And maybe it's just not realistic. And I went to a conference, and at the conference, there was a former, or actually, maybe he was still current, guidebook author, very prolific, who had also written for National Geographic. And he did a keynote, and he was talking about how he used the expertise that he had in certain destinations, to land all of these gigs, from guidebooks to expeditions, etc. And I was sitting there thinking, wow, I want to do what he does. Maybe I should write guidebooks, or maybe I should use all of the knowledge that I accumulated on Belize and do something with it. And just to backtrack a little bit, the first time I went to Belize was the year prior to that conference, or 2 years prior to that conference. And it was just because I had miles, and I had time, and I wanted to go somewhere. And it was between Panama and Belize. And I chose Belize just because it sounded different, and didn't know much about it. And I was supposed to spend 10 days there, and I spent 3 weeks. I kept extending. And I made some friends there while I was in the Cayo districts in Sino Belize. I'm going to name the districts, in the western, district of Cayo. And they were like, well, if you want, you can go on a road trip with us. We're going to drive all the way down south to the beach to Placencia. And I thought, my God, a road trip. I can't miss this. So I extended my trip, went on this a really fun road trip with them. And so I spent 3 weeks in Belize. And when I left, I thought, my God, like, how come no one talks about Belize? This is crazy. This is an amazing little place, so diverse, so many cultures, and nature. And so anyway, when I went to the conference, on my way back home, I was at that point where I was like, I don't know if this is going to work out. What should I do with this? And I got an email from one of my blog readers who said, hey, I just saw this listing, and I think you'd be a great fit for it. And I'm like, what is this? And I click on it, and it's actually a Craigslist entry. And it was for authoring Moon Belize guidebook for Moon Guides. They were looking for a new author. The previous author was retiring. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was kind of just a sign, and I thought, this is crazy. And I emailed the contact and asked if they were still looking, because it was like a couple weeks old. And she immediately replied. She happened to be the acquisitions editor. And she said, yes, I'm interviewing on Monday. And it was like a Friday. Yeah. I'm interviewing on Monday. You can get me your resume, your cover letter, and your samples by Monday. I spent all weekend basically just crafting the perfect letter of why I was a person who knew Belize and who should write this next edition, and just putting everything together. And from there, it was a long process. It was like a 2 or 3 month process of submitting a book proposal, which I'd never done before. But they gave you a guideline of how to prepare for it. And just working my butt off, for those summer months just to get that in. And eventually I got selected, and everything changed after that, because, a lot of folks were trying to discourage me from doing the guidebooks. They were like, oh, there's no money in that. It's a lot of work for very little. And you shouldn't do it. And these were, with all due respect, these were white male editors who were telling me this, who were writers who was telling me this. And I'm like, well, maybe for you it's, not an opportunity anymore. But for me, as a Black female who's trying to enter into travel writing, I think it could be my leg up, and I think it would give me credibility on the place and on the destination that editors I pitch would then pay attention, and it worked out exactly as I thought. It gave me huge credibility. It was a chance to showcase my writing, my photography, and get me many, many, many more assignments for years, including from tourism boards, all sorts of types of writing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I imagine too, it also gave you, confidence and a place to stand on when you managed to do that. And I kind of see you in that moment, like answering the Craigslist ad and inventing yourself as this person, right? Like prior to you were not Lily, the guidebook writer, you were like trying to do all these things, and all of a sudden you just create that person. And I think that's one thing that's so amazing about, entrepreneurship or being in freelance and all these things. You constantly, like, you stand at this bottom of this mountain, and you're not the person that can get to the top of that mountain. And you're kind of standing there knowing, and you're like, no one else notices, but I'm going to try and do this anyway.
I can do it. Yeah.
And you just somehow become the person that does it. And I think those experiences are so empowering as well. And that's what allows you to kind of like knock on the next door and get to the next place.
Yeah. So at that point, I took it on full time because it just required so much focus and work, and it was fine with me. So I went to Belize, and I just decided to do the long-term thing in Belize while I researched my book. And I did that for several years. And after that followed a Dominican Republic moon guide. They basically just called me one day. We're like, hey, we want to do a Dominican Republic title because it's becoming, the number one destination in the Caribbean. And, since you like the Caribbean, we thought maybe you'd be interested in trying first. I still had to submit a book proposal. And I said, yeah, I thought about it for like 2 seconds. And I didn't know that they are as well as I did Belize at the time. But I was like, yeah, I can do it, and it's a huge country, by the way. So it was a challenge, but I stayed a whole year in the Dominican Republic, and I just basically went from province to province and lived in different areas. And it was hands down one of the best years of my life, I have to say. It was so great to discover a completely different side of this country that again, no one was talking about. It was always about Punta Cana, or if it's not, it's about Haiti and the DR, but never the DR in and of itself, and all of the cultural differences and intricacies and in the food and in the climate, it's so diverse. There's a mountainous side to it, there's a beach side. So it was really great to have that experience. And I will never regret being a guidebook author. And every time somebody says, don't do it like the guidebook says, just throw the guidebook away, I think it's just a complete lie. It depends which guidebook you're using.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree, because for me, especially before we had internet and social media and all these things, that is how I discovered destination. I mean, that was my Bible and my holy grail in my backpack
Yeah,
as I moved through a destination.
exactly.
But I definitely would sit in the bookstore or the library and read them all and find the person who I thought was experiencing a destination like me. And I do think that was important, because there were certain guidebooks I definitely would throw away, because that just wasn't how I wanted to engage
Yes.
the destination. So I love that you were able to kind of, again, like as your storytelling voice is growing, like you're moving that into these guidebooks and being able to engage people to be present to different things in each destination that you're telling the story of. And I think that's really the beginnings of probably of responsible and ethical storytelling, and
Yes.
and really showing all these different perspectives. So how I ended up, I think, besides the Belize guidebook, which I realized farther afterward, that was you, really kind of come into contact with your work, was during the pandemic when you were working at Skift. And, this was a time when there was I feel like a huge shift in the way we began to talk about travel. And for me, that's where this podcast came from, was in that moment where travel was in such turmoil, and there was so much conversation about how bad tourism was, and all of these, there was just such upheaval. I kept thinking about the people that were talking about sustainability and climate action in travel, and that all these people had been doing this for years and years and years, but now seemed like the moment where, if we just shine the light on them, it might be the time that these conversations could actually be on the main stage instead of like the small room.
Ah,
And that's what I kind of saw you doing, is creating a space for these conversations, and a place for action around actually building travel back better. So I'd love to hear from you, like, what was that period of time like in your career with all of this happening?
sure. It's a big question.
It is.
I agree with you. I think it was such a pivotal time. The opportunity came really in 2020, in September-ish 2020, I think. There was an article that came out that listed 15 Black writers that you should follow in Forbes. And I think that article just got around. And as you remember, we had a really horrible summer of reckoning, not just in the US, but just across the world, with racial tensions and riots and, pushback basically on so many years of oppression. And violence, police violence. And somehow that got translated into travel. I'm not sure how, but that happened. And so Skift had reached out, and I started freelancing for them, and I guess they liked my freelance pieces. And after about a couple of pieces, it just so happened that their tourism reporter had left. And I hadn't worked full time for a single company for a long time because I'd been a freelancer. And I think it just came at a really good time when we weren't traveling. I wasn't thinking of traveling, obviously, with the pandemic. And it was a chance to weigh in on tourism, and all of the things that were happening. I could see how the Caribbean was being really hit hard. And I've always said that the Caribbean was kind of like my school for tourism. Um, when you live in places, and I know you know this, when you live in places long term or over a certain period of time, over and over, and you get to know them really well, and you really see the underbelly of tourism, it really makes you think. And I've always been aware of of my surroundings, I guess, because of my multicultural background and how things affect different people. And I see it, in the Caribbean. There's a good side of tourism. I've met so many people through my guidebooks who are making an incredible living from tourism in a healthy way, in a sustainable way. But there are also a lot of people who are just being exploited, And I always told myself, as a result of living in the Caribbean, that I would never be part of a system that exploits other people. And I don't want to be, as much as I can. So me entering Skift at that time and bringing with me all of my experience, more than a decade of being on the road and seeing how tourism really functioned before everything shut down, was a chance to weigh in on the things that I cared about, equity in tourism, sustainability. What does that really mean? And I had done a little bit of opinionated pieces on my own blog before, but Skift was definitely a shift, because now I was talking to executives. I was talking to leaders, in the travel industry. That's the audience, it's Skift. Our events were attended by, CEOs of every travel company you can think of, from Expedia to, Airbnb, etc. So tackling tourism, then I was, in the beginning, it was kind of like, who am I? What's the voice I'm going to bring to this? How do I tackle everything that's happening in tourism and everything that people are talking about? And I remember my editor said, I wrote a piece and my editor said, I feel like you have more to say. I think you should just own your voice, own what you have to say, because I think you have more to say. And honestly, that was a shift for me. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm just gonna let it all, on the page, And I just really started owning fully what I thought should change and how, and talking, obviously interviewing people to also learn about that, right? Everything from over tourism to changing the success metrics, moving away from just arrivals, which really means very little in the grand scheme of things. And how should we be measuring the success of tourism in the future? I wrote about, so many things. I just, it was a great opportunity to touch on the things that I think no one really was truly addressing. And hearing afterwards from, tourism boards, telling me that they read my articles, every time I have an article, they've all read it. That was just so amazing to me. I never expected that. And it was really eye-opening, I guess, and humbling. And I think there are many good people. I do think there are many good leaders in tourism who want to do the right thing. They want to do better. They're constrained by many factors, obviously, because they're not the sole decision makers, perhaps. But there are many folks who are trying to do better. And that kind of gave me hope, and pushed me forward in my storytelling. And I tried to address things that I would see in the news that I think probably no one would talk about, like I remember South Africa launched a tourism equity fund, which is really unique effort. Unfortunately, it all fell apart. But like you said, also vaccine equity. I couldn't believe that people were traveling and not caring about where they were going, where people didn't have access to vaccines yet. Because I grew up, when I was growing up in West Africa, there's no way I would have made it there without my vaccines, right? We were privileged enough to get vaccinations. So I knew the importance of vaccination and having access to a life-saving medicine that many don't have. And so it would be absurd for me inconceivable, to travel. And I'm going to go into a community where they haven't had that chance to have the life-saving medicine. And so it just became really like, something that was gnawing at me. And I wrote that first vaccine equity piece and then some follow-ups. And I saw companies like Intrepid Travel follow afterwards from my vaccine piece, and Expedia, I think also, announcing vaccine campaigns and so on. And so you can never underestimate who's reading you. And that's why when you produce content, you have to be so conscious of what you produce for the benefit of others, not just consumers, but also decision makers.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean the vaccine equity article for me came at such a critical time because it was something I had been thinking about and something I had been voicing my opinion about, but
Mhm.
this was something we've never faced before, right? So we
Yeah.
don't even really know kind of what fight we're fighting if we're fighting about it and how to talk about it. But something in myself, I had a trip that I was supposed to bring to Guatemala, and I just
Mm.
kept going back and forth. And I said, I end in some real rural and remote areas of Peru, and I said, I'm not going to run my trips. And people said, why? I said, I could never live with myself if I was the person that brought any sort of illness to those communities. I'm like, as a traveler prior to that, even thinking about things like strep or flu,
Ah,
those are things we can easily deal with. But when you get
yeah.
into some communities where they don't
Yeah.
clean water or medicines
Right.
to treat certain things, like it's very impactful.
Yeah.
And so when you think about something like COVID and access to healthcare, and how in the areas I'd gone they'd lost many roads, I'm like, this would be a huge venture to get someone to healthcare and the things they were facing anyway. I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
so reading that, it was so powerful for me to say, aha, this is something we really do need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Sometimes that's how it is. You have this voice in the back of your head, and then you read something that aligns. I think that what you said about healthcare is 100% true, and I don't even think people are malicious. I think that a lot of times they're just not aware enough. They haven't lived abroad.
Mhm.
They've gone just for vacation. They don't really know what it's like to have a healthcare care crisis in that country, or how much healthcare access people have. And so you have to just break it down to them. Somebody said to me once that they think my power is in being able to write in a way that is easy to understand, kind of like breaking down a complex issue. And so I broke it down. That's what I was doing, breaking it down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So it
Yeah.
worked.
No.
I guess it resonated. I was very, very, again, it's great to see the response, and having a good pairing with a powerful platform, like Skift. So
Yeah. No. I really I really recognize and honor what that really did. And I think the other thing that it did for me, talking with other people that are content creators and writers, was open up our eyes to, should we be talking about social issues in the context of tourism? You kind of mentioned, how did all of these things funnel through tourism? But for me, I feel like one of the great things about working in tourism is that everything does funnel through tourism, because we are going everywhere and we're engaging in such different ways, that part of that experience is understanding all these different things that are happening in destinations, and how we impact that as we move through areas. And so um, again, this
yeah,
was something I got excited about, because I've been really passionate about how sustainability and gender equity intersect. And so, a piece like this was one of the things that was like, oh, I think we're at a space where we can start, like, really looking into some of these things. And so I would love for us to spend, a little bit of time talking about the responsibility we hold as travel writers and content creators and storytellers of people in place. And like, did you have an awareness of kind of that power at a certain point? And for people who are listening and hadn't really thought about this, what are things they might be reflecting on, or how can they understand like what that far reaching impact is, and the responsibility we do have?
gosh, yeah, it's such a huge topic. I think for me to start with, I've just always been I've always been conscious of what I put on a page. First of all, probably my lawyer background helps with that. But also just very early on when I had my blog and I was writing about places, the feedback that I would get. And I understand that people always appreciate learning new things about places. They want to learn. And so that's kind of how I approached it, was more sort of from an educational perspective. yes, have fun, but at the same time, here's what you should also know. That resonated. And then from there, the whole influencer phase that followed, that I hoped was going to disappear after the pandemic, but did not. I think my advice really is you have to know why you're producing the content you're producing and what is it giving back to the world. It can't just be about you. That's my opinion. I understand people make money from posing in different outfits and whatnot, but at the end of the day, if you're truly a tourism advocate, you should know what your platform or what your content brings to other people. And it could be joyful things, but just what does it bring? What is it teaching us about the world? What is it teaching us about other people like us across the world? That's what tourism is at the end of the day. Yes, it's fun. And at the same time, it's a responsibility. At the same time, tourism is economic development for many places.
Mm-hmm.
It's their the food they put on the table. It's not just entertainment for a lot of people. So how do you balance and use your privilege to get it to highlight folks who perhaps don't have the platform that you have, but bring something valuable as well to the world. So I've always felt like there are undertones of saviorism. When people try to tell stories about how they did something great abroad, it always kind of comes off a bit, I don't know, a bit icky, kind of, because it's like, oh, here's these women, you should help them. But there's a way to tell stories that isn't savior type, that doesn't have that tone. And the way to think about it is that, yes, you're bringing the economic side of it, with your tourism dollars. But on the other hand, you're getting a valuable exchange. You're getting culture, heritage, that you can't get anywhere else, or that you wouldn't have the experience with anyone else. So it has value. It may not be dollars that you see, but as I've said before, on a different, I've said this many times when I talk to people, and it's like, don't make it sound like it's a charity. It's not charity. It's an exchange,
Mm-hmm.
a cultural exchange with different forms of compensation. So when you're telling the story, be aware of that, be aware of what your story brings. What are you teaching us? What's the wonderful human exchange you had, or lesson? There's always a lesson. So what's the lesson? And then we learn through you, and put voices, in your stories of people from those places, because it's not your culture, it's not your heritage, it's what you're learning through them. Mm-hmm. So, that's one of the ways that I try to balance my stories is to share, but through the voices of others. And I'm very conscious about the voices I use, increasingly so after being a business reporter. I see a lot of stories about a lot of places that completely lack diversity and a diverse perspective. And, that's a failure for all of us. We don't learn anything from that, from hearing the same voices. So I do that even today. I try as much as I can to, even if it takes me extra time, and it almost always does, but that's fine. That's not an excuse. And I do it. So I, if I'm talking about a certain destination, there's no way I'm not going to have, let's say I had a Caribbean story come out today, it wouldn't sit right with me to not have a Caribbean voice in there, or two or three, just as much as I can, and balance it with obviously the resort owners, or luxury resorts, and often not owners of color. So yeah, all of, it requires intention, and you just have to care. It's really that simple. You just have to care.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective on that. And I do think an intention is a huge piece of it. Just if, like you said, if you know why you're doing it, and you know who this story is about and for, and what you want the action to be as a result of someone reading that story, then I feel like you're on the right path, and you might still have, an impact you didn't intend, or you might not, you might not get it right, in air quotes, for people listening to the podcast, because
Yeah.
it's hard to tell what's right all the time, or right
Right,
choice.
right.
But I think when you're operating from that place, because it can get very intimidating, then if you are conscious of all these things, to then not just be paralyzed and not do anything, because you're
Yeah, I
realizing
understand.
what the pieces are. But
I understand. I mean,
yeah,
it comes easy to, again, it comes easy to me because I have this multicultural background, I'm a
yeah,
Black woman, and I just get, move around places easier, and some places, not all, but I get it, and you know what? Doing a guidebook got me over my fear of talking to random people, which isn't as easy, even when you've been raised like multicultural like me. I had to just talk to completely random strangers every day, at least like maybe 6 or 7 or 10 people per day, from the food cart owner to, the hotel manager to, I mean, whoever, and just talk to them. And that got me over my fear very quickly,
yeah,
uh, of approaching people and not knowing what to say, or if you're saying it right, or if you're saying the right words. And now it's even worse. I mean, now it's like, watch out what word you say. But yeah, so
yeah. But don't you
just
also?
start somewhere.
Mhm. I was going to say, don't you also find that in those conversations too? I think the thing for me that is really what I love about it is, then you find that everybody, well, one, you really realize every person is a person, and every person has such an
Yes.
interesting story. And then the more you do that as well, like the more excited you are about like overcoming that discomfort in order to hear that story.
Yeah. I find that most people are very receptive of you being interested in who they are and what they do and where they're from. I think that there's and I could give you an example, but I've been on a trip where, you have 2, 3 journalists who just walk into a market, they have their cameras out, and they just want pretty photos. But there's no real genuine interest in the folks who are selling in the market, who, by the way, are standing there for hours selling their stuff, and they just need to make money for the day and go home. They have families, they have things to do. They're running a business. But these influencers will come in and just want their pictures. And then when it doesn't go their way, they'll go back and say, oh, they were so not friendly. I don't know why they were so unfriendly.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you just pause and remember that everyone, like you just said, is a person with a life and a business, it's just common sense, right? Would you do that back in, I don't know, the US or the UK? Probably not. You wouldn't just walk in and put a camera in front of someone and click, and not talk to them. That's just not happening. So why would it happen overseas? It's just common sense.
Mm-hmm.
Treat people like people, and just say hi, I'm so curious, what's this? I'm new here. It's my first time traveling here. These are some of the things that I say. It's
Mm-hmm.
my first time in Antigua. I'd love to try some fruits from here. Can you show me? And most of the time people will be more than happy. And at the end of your exchange, you can say like, do you mind if I take a picture? And almost always it's a yes.
Mm-hmm.
Buy some stuff, obviously. And then
Yeah.
not always, of course, that doesn't always apply. It's just very tricky, right? But we can't treat people like they're just exhibits. Um, they're humans. They have lives, and they have a lot going on too. So um, I would hope that the last 3 years have enlightened more people in terms of like how we treat each other, abroad, and how we approach our stories, and how we go about sharing what we learn on the road. I will say that I think it has with many people, but I think that it's not as many as it should have been.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the same old has continued. And I just want to say, by the way, I meant to mention this earlier, but about the part about me writing all those articles at Skift. I will say that, you don't see it when you're not the one doing it, but it takes a toll. There's a real mental toll to writing about the really difficult issues in tourism, right? And it's very hard to do day in, day out. And so after 2 years of doing it, it was really, really hard for me to continue. Um, and I think that a lot of people don't realize that. So if you're beating yourself up thinking, oh, I should write about these important issues all the time and whatnot, no, you don't have to. You can just, mix up your content, occasionally talk about something you've noticed or that you've learned about, but don't beat yourself up thinking you have to write these heavy pieces all the time, because I don't think it's good, mentally. It takes a toll. This is a real issues involving real people. And for me, it was almost very personal because I've lived it, and I know I know a lot of people in tourism, a lot, who get a fair shake and who don't as well. So that part was hard for me, and I needed to take a break after a couple of years, and travel was returning, so it was great that I had an opportunity open up to write for consumers again. So yeah.
Thank you. I think that's really powerful, because I do know a lot of people that that's their area of focus, and I see what it does take of them, and they feel really responsible to continue to create content in that way. And I honor them for that, but I also see how heavy it is to stay in that space all of the time. And I think it's really important to, like you said, allow yourself to,
Yeah.
You're having a huge impact, whether you're writing one article or 5 or
Yes,
10 articles.
absolutely.
And so it's, I think, good to
Yeah.
recognize that as well.
Self-care. I think self-care is a very underrated thing as a travel journalist or travel, digital creator. Self-care is critical, and that comes first.
Yeah. Well, before we end, I would love to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about Tourism Lens. I know that's what I really was excited when I saw you were launching, that aspect of your business, and I'd love to hear more about what you're doing there.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yes. So, speaking of not wanting to talk about issues all the time, I still went ahead and created a revamped media platform called Tourism Lens. And it's really more of my content in terms of telling sustainability stories around travel. There's a newsy side, which is more for the industry, because I've brought with me a lot of folks who used to follow my work at Skift and have subscribed. And then there's a consumer-facing side, which will be tips from the road, sustainability stories. And it's very new. It's only just like 2 months old. So eventually the plan is to grow it with contributors from different parts of the world to reflect the diverse perspectives that I believe should exist, about the travel industry from various corners. And so that's really my dream, is to grow it, to have multiple contributions. And I've also kicked off a series of interviews with sustainability folks who are either, it's going to be either leaders or, anyone in sustainability who's doing great work, interesting work in their destination. So I hope it becomes, this hub where people go to read about the things that many people don't want to talk about, but that is independent, honest, and showcases folks in tourism who might not have had the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. I can't wait to see, what that looks like in a year or 2 or 3. And I do think that there's so many people that will get behind, the intention that you have for this. So I wish you, so much momentum for it. And yeah, well, the last thing I have before we end is just a series of rapid fire or rapid fire-ish questions in our call. So the first one is, what are you reading right now?
Oh my goodness. I'm actually not reading anything right now, although I have a bunch of books on my list. But no, I've not had any time to read between work full time and my side newsletter for Tourism Lens. So I usually honestly, I'm always in tourism articles, either academic articles or stories. So
Yeah, when you're researching and reading all the time for everything else, it's
hard.
I
Yeah.
recently just picked up something that was complete, just like lighthearted reading, which I haven't done in such a long time. And I was like, at first I was really resisting it because I felt like I'm wasting my
Yeah.
time in this. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and now just even the last couple days as I go to bed, I'm like, oh, I'm finding I'm really excited to just read again and not falling asleep and like reconnecting to,
Yeah.
that. So I think it's good to do once in a
Yeah.
while too.
For now, for now, I focused on working out again and getting back on my health track. So I've been walking. That's my hiking, my big thing right now. So no, I have not had time to
Yeah.
read.
The next, what is always in your suitcase or backpack when you travel?
Oh my gosh. Well, my laptop for sure. My laptop, my iPhone, in my bag, a scarf.
Mhm.
I always have a scarf because I'm always chilly in places. And it has many uses, cover my hair, all kinds of things.
Mhm.
Um, gosh, what else? Yeah, I guess yeah, my
That's
makeup bag. Yeah, basics. I'm pretty simple.
Yeah, those are good things to have. To sojourn is to travel somewhere as if you live there for a short while and be immersed and connected to a place. Where is a place that you would love to sojourn?
Oh my gosh, my list is so long. I would love to go to Cape Verde, mm, explore there for a while. I'd love to go to uh, Botswana and maybe go on a safaris. I've never gone on safari before. I'd love to go to Egypt, Mauritius. I mean, the list is like
Yeah,
really long.
I know
My
it would be.
problem, my problem is that I'm not very good with short stays. I don't get a lot of satisfaction out of a week-long stay. It actually frustrates me. And so it's tough. I got to figure out how to stay for a month at least.
Mhm.
Yeah. But Peru's also up there. I'm hoping to make it this year to Peru.
I have the same problem. Like I would wish I could just move everywhere
Yeah,
for
yeah,
like 3 or 4 months or a year, and
yeah.
not very practical, I guess. What is something that you eat that immediately connects you to a place you've been?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would definitely say Ethiopian food takes me right back to my everything about me. I guess my heritage, my mom's cooking, and my visits Ethiopia visits. Yeah, there's nothing like Ethiopian food for me. It's like number one.
Yeah. Who was a person that inspired or encouraged you to set out and explore the world?
Hmm. I would say probably my dad. My dad was the one who really opened the gates, and encouraged me to go study abroad when I was a teen. So I think that even though he probably never imagined that I would continue on to become a digital nomad, I think that this constant encouragement of, you can do anything, you can be independent, you can do what you love, and you can be successful, and you can be smart, and you can be someone. Um, that was always the message, and I'm pretty sure none of that would have happened if he wasn't such a strong believer in education, and part of that is world education through travel.
Yeah, thank you. If you could take an adventure with one person, fictional or real, alive or past, who would it be?
Oh my gosh. Fictional adventure. Gosh, I think Nelson Mandela. I'd love to meet. Um, Emperor Haile Selassie, who was a former emperor in Ethiopia, very iconic African leader. Um, Gosh, you said fictional or
Yeah, those are both beautiful
oh,
examples.
fictional? Okay.
Fictional or real, alive or past.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last one is Soul of Travel is a place for honoring women in the tourism industry. Who is one woman you admire and would love to recognize in this space?
That's right. I forgot you had that question there. I should have given it. But there's so many amazing women. Gosh, I could shout out my friend Andrea Reese, who is in Toronto, Canada, um, who I really admire because she passes on her Jewish ancestry and heritage to her kids in such a beautiful way, through her cooking, through celebrations, religious ceremonies. And I think that's hard to do in the modern day, and she does it really nicely. Amazing. And oh my gosh, I could think of so many women. It's so hard to pick. I really honor women who speak up, women in tourism who are unafraid and speak up of what's right and what's wrong. And for example, there's a lady called Mel Martinez, who's an indigenous Garifuna in Hopkins, Belize. And I really admire her fearlessness in speaking up about what she thinks is not going well in Belize tourism and what is, and why the indigenous Garifuna have to look out for themselves as opposed to being exploited. Women are just, this tourism industry wouldn't be anything without women, period, at any level.
Yeah.
But I could name so many. I don't want to feel like any people are going to be like, you left me out.
Yeah, we'll know that you are honoring and recognizing many of them even without mentioning their name. But I love what you said about how vital women's roles are. And it's one thing through this podcast that like every person I meet, kind of opens the door to 5, 10, 15 more women who are doing amazing things at all, all levels of the tourism industry, and not just in executive roles, but as community leaders. And, going back to how we say that tourism really is, integrated into all these aspects of our world. It's so important, I think, to have these conversations and bring these stories, out into the world.
Yes, I
Sure.
agree. Thank you for doing that on your
Yeah.
podcast.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I have been looking forward to it for quite a long time, far before I even asked you, and just imagined that we might have this conversation. So thank you for joining me and for sharing, your story with us here on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Christine. It was really fun talking to you today, and really meaningful. So thank you.
Thank you.